Hey guys, today I'm going to be showing you how to make this amazing frozen fever cake from the new short film Frozen Fever that's out in front of the Cinderella movies at the moment. I'm going to use a batch of my mud cake mix because this is going to be a stacked cake. So I know this is going to be a really nice, firm, solid cake. You need to carve away any crispy edges from the tops and the edges of your mud cake. That's just from the baking process. And then you can either use a cake leveler, or I'm just going to be risky and do it by eye. You just want to cut your mud cake into 3 layers. Now I like to use a little series of cake boards with kind of some non-slip mat, just separating the different cake boards. So I've got one that's going to be my one that gets messy, and then my other one is my support board, which is the same size as the cake that I'm working with. So pop down a little bit of that ganache onto the cake board, and then stack your first layer of cake. Then you want to give it a really nice, but not too thick, little coat of ganache in between the layers. This kind of sticks everything together, but it also gives you some really nice, delicious, fudgy chocolate in the middle of your mud cake layers. I'm only making 2 cakes here because this is a massive cake, so I'm going to show you how to cover and use polystyrene or styrofoam layers for the bottom 2, and the top 2 layers are going to feed about 30 people, which in my opinion is about as many people as you want at a kid's party anyway. On goes the second layer of mud cake, and repeat the process with a bit more ganache, and then on goes the top layer. Make sure that you are giving your sides and the top of your top layer a really nice thin crumb coat of ganache, and then you want to pop that off into the fridge for about 15 minutes to let that first coat firm up. Once it's firmed up, you can come back and add a generous amount of ganache all around the outsides, and you really want to add a fair bit here because you want it to go like sort of out over the outer edges of that cake board. Then I'm going to use a scraper to scrape back those edges. You might need to do this a couple of times. You really want to make sure that you get a really nice, smooth finish and you don't have any little air pockets or anything. And once you're happy with your sides, you can use your little scraper just to even off the top. Not worrying about the top edge of your cake, so long as you're relatively happy with the smoothness of the top and you're really happy with the smoothness of the sides, you can pop that back off into the fridge only for about 15 minutes to firm it up. And then I like to use either a hot knife or some boiling water and my offset spatula. And I sort of heat up the spatula and then use the heat in the spatula to trim away any of those edges and just do a bit more smoothing to make sure I've got a really nice, even, level, smooth, perfectly ganached cake. When you're happy with the shape of your cake, brush it with either some plain water, or you can make a really easy, simple syrup by just microwaving a tablespoon of apricot jam with about 30 ml of plain water. Pop down a generous amount of corn flour and roll your fondant out to about 2 or 3 mils, and then you want to pick it up and place it over your moistened, water-covered cake. Now secure your top edges first here. Make sure that they're really nice and flat, and try and push any air pockets that you might see out to the sides. And then you want to secure the top of your outside edge. Once you're happy that everything's looking nice and firmly stuck down, then you can use the heel of your hand or the palm of your hand to sort of just smooth around the outside edges. And you can see that I'm pulling the fondant out a little bit as I smooth it down to stop me getting any wrinkles. Before you trim them away, you want to push the fondant right into the base of the cake so that it's forming a bit of a seal. And once you're happy that it's all sort of pushed almost into the cake board, then you can use a pizza cutter rather than a knife to trim right up close to the cake all the way around the edges and remove any excess. Smooth that off as best as you can with your hand, and then if you've got something like, I've got one of these really cute little, they're actually called a cake smoother. If you don't have one of those, you can just use something that's quite firm and it's not going to stick to the fondant. So something like a book or something like that that's going to give you a little bit more stability just to kind of really flatten out those edges. With your actual cake layer covered, now you can cover your polystyrene layer. Polystyrene is really, really easy to cover. You're just going to brush it with water all over, and then you're going to roll out your nice thin fondant. Don't go too thin on the fondant with poly because it's got a really sharp, crisp edge and the fondant can tend to rip sometimes. Same process as with your actual cake. You're just going to use the palm of your hand to really smooth that down, pulling out the lips of your fondant and making sure you've got a lovely, neat finish. Now for this cake, you've got a 14-inch and an 11-inch polystyrene layer, so cover both of those. And then you've got an 8-inch and a 6-inch actual cake layer. So you want to ganache and cover both of the cake layers and just fondant cover both of the poly layers. You can move off your messy temporary board and onto a nice presentation board. Pop down a little blob of ganache, and then you just want to pick up your polystyrene bottom layer, which is your 14-inch, a little bit more ganache, and on goes your 11-inch polystyrene layer. And then on goes your 8-inch cake layer. Now with the 8-inch cake layer, you need a bit of support in this to hold the weight of the 6-inch. So I'm going to use 3 fat straws. These are plastic straws. They are non-toxic. They're really easy to cut, and I'm just going to trim them off to the same height as the cake. If you don't have straws, you can use something like dowels or wooden skewers here. A little bit more ganache goes on, and on goes my top layer of cake, and the cake is now stacked and ready to decorate. We're going to roll out 2 long fondant sausages, about the width of one of your fingers, maybe a smaller finger, and you're actually going to roll about 1,000 of these sausages for the rest of this cake, so I apologize if you don't like rolling them. You want to take a little bit of water and just paint like a fine line around the bottom of that base tier, and then you're going to pick up one of your sausages and drape it around the front. Now at this point you want to choose what side of your cake's going to be the front and what's going to be the back, and try to stick to that because you want all your joins and everything to stay at the back, and you always want your best side forward. I'm joining this in 2 pieces because it's just easier than rolling one really long one, and then I'm going to use the back of my knife, press it in at about 1 inch intervals, and then just kind of tilt it from side to side. Repeat that around the little joins for all of your layers, and then you want to roll some more sausages, and what you're looking for here is a really, really nice thin coil of fondant that's about 18 centimeters in length. So I've got a template that I'm going to link to on that Cupcake Addiction website for you for the little scrolls that go around the outside, and also for the little topper. I'll link to that down below. You just want to put some wax paper over top of the scrolls and basically use the fondant little snake to create the same pattern. Pop those off to the side because you need them to be semi-set before you start trying to stick them on the cake. To make your sunflowers, I'm using a series of plunger cutters. So these normally come in sets of 3. I've got 2 of the largest sunflower cutters, and then I've got a medium-sized daisy cutter. Really widely available on eBay and also Amazon, and you shouldn't have to pay too much for these. You want to roll out your yellow fondant quite thin, and then use your plunger cutter to plunge down. You'll see that I'm really kind of squizzing it around on the bench to make sure I get a nice, neat sidewall. And then you just pop it out, and it literally plunges it out onto the table. Cut out one of the smaller ones and then put a little bit of that water onto your larger. And I find it easiest just to plunge the second sunflower straight on top of that first one because it stops it from flopping around and all of those little kind of petals going everywhere. Once that one's down, you want to take one of your mini Oreo cookies, and then you're going to use the cream to actually stick that down and make your sunflower center. For your smaller sunflowers, they don't have a sunflower cutter this small, so I'm just going to use a daisy. Push it, plunge it, pop it out, and a little brown M&M stuck on with a tiny bit of water makes your little sunflower center. Leave those ones to semi-set at room temperature on a piece of baking paper, and you want to set them for about half an hour. You don't want them to be fully set because they need a little bit of flexibility. If there is a part to this cake that I hated, it's the draping. It's not hard, it's just really time consuming. So you want to roll out nice, thin, long pieces of fondant, cut them into shorter lengths, and then paint the back with a bit of water. You just want to attach one end to your cake and then just sort of let it drape down. And once you're happy with the positioning, push it down with your finger and that water will kind of glue it to the side of the fondant. I recommend only doing enough of the fondant snakes for 2 of these bits of draping at a time because any longer it has a tendency to break. And make sure that you start and finish at the back because that way if you've kind of got an unevenly sized or shaped piece at the very, very end, it's all hidden at the back. I used smaller yellow 6-lets for the top layer, and you can see that my draping got smaller and tighter with each layer as I got higher. And then I used larger 6-lets for the bottom 3 tiers and just a little bit of water down to attach those on. It'll kind of glue them to the cake. Taking your small daisies now, a little bit of water on the back, and you can see how semi-setting them means that they're sort of firm enough that we can work with, but they're not so firm that they don't have a little bit of flexibility that helps them kind of pop up off the cake a little bit. Use your water to glue them in between those little pieces of draping, and then you want to take your semi-set little swirls and once again a bit of water on the back and stick them straight to the side of the cake. You can see here how semi-setting those has really improved the ability to be able to pick them up and move them around. Pop some icing sugar or some powdered sugar into a sifter and you're just going to give your cake a really nice light dusting of snow. And then you want to roll out a little bit of green fondant and take a circle cutter to make some leaves. If you've got a leaf cutter, that's nice too, and we'll give you a slightly more detailed leaf, but I'm just going to use a knife just to put on like the little center line and some little lines up the edges to give it the veining. Take one of your semi-set sunflowers and put a bit of water on the back, and then you want to take it and you're going to position it. So I started at the front here rather than the back because I want my front to be really nice and even. And you can see there, because they're still a bit flexible, they kind of could like move around that draping and they sit in, but they still pop up off the cake and they're firm enough to hold their own weight. A bit of water on the back of your leaf and one of those goes down next to each of your sunflowers. Don't put these sunflowers too close together because A, they'll look messy, but B, you'll have to make a ton more of them, and ain't nobody got time for that. So when you get to your next tier up, you want to make sure that your sunflowers are in between the two sunflowers that you've placed on the tier down below. Once again, don't worry if this isn't the case all the way around. Look with your eye for the nicest and most even positioning without your sunflowers being too close together, and make sure you've got a leaf beside each one. There'll be a link on the blog post to this little topper, so you just want to cut it out, and I printed mine out on some like heavy duty cardstock. Cut around it and then use 2 long skewers and some sticky tape just to give it some kind of toothpicky legs to stick into the cake. Stick that in as your cake topper and your frozen fever cake is now complete. One of the things I love about this cake is that it's massive and over the top, but you're not going to be left with a ton of leftover cake. Like, this thing's the size of a wedding cake, guys.